All right, everyone, welcome back to Chapter 3. This is one of the last lessons we'll do of the semester, talking about good and bad sampling. The objective today is to talk about different types of sampling, okay? Um, and that would be three different types. We're going to talk about three different types: convenience sampling, voluntary response sampling, and random sampling, okay? And more specifically, when we talk about sampling, we want to talk about how they are affected by bias, okay? And bias is this very big word. It's a very important word that you've probably already come across in your day-to-day lives, but the bias I'm talking about is specifically sampling method bias. Okay, so you may be familiar with how bias works and how bias operates. It kind of affects every little piece of our lives. Okay, there is almost nothing that is not biased. Okay, in terms of media, portrayal of data, all that stuff we talked about with the misleading stuff at the very beginning of the semester. But with this lesson, we're only talking about statistical sampling method bias. Okay, and it's very, very easy. Okay, basically you have bias if your results, from that study are consistently underestimating or overestimating whatever you're measuring. Okay. So, in other words, if you do a couple of similar studies based on your one study and you find that they are consistently different from each other, you know that the execution of one of those studies had some sampling method bias. Okay, sampling method bias. So keep that in mind as I talk about these next three techniques. That the bias I'm talking about doesn't really have anything to do with the bias you may be familiar with. Okay. I'm talking specifically about ways in which when you choose to measure something, that's the sampling method bias I'm talking about, that gets affected by the method you choose. So let's get into it. Here's our first method, convenience sampling. All right, convenience sampling. This is when you choose an individual from the population, which we should have learned from last time. Population is what the type of individual is, and then individual is obviously the individuals in that group. Okay, for example, people in Indianapolis could be your population, and some random person living in Indianapolis apartments could be your individual, something like that. Okay. But this is a convenience sample when you choose individuals that are easy to reach and convenient to reach, which is why they're called convenient samples. And it's likely that you've done this yourself in the class, especially with those two quantitative or categorical variable mastery projects. Maybe you ask your relatives, maybe you ask your friends, your phone contacts, maybe you look at the first result on Google if you were doing that. Those are all forms of convenience sampling. Convenience sampling. Okay, and let's go ahead and do a quick example here, just to make sure you've got the thing down. There are three cases I'm going to give you. Select which one you think is an example of convenience sampling. All right. Is it A, B, or C? And I'll let you read those over, give you a few minutes to take that time to guess which one is which. All right, and if you picked B, that is the correct answer. Leo works with his coworkers, so of course it would be easy for him to ask how long they spend commuting to and from work. In part A, they're looking at a database and they're compiling data from everywhere, so they're not really looking at a convenience there. And in part C, it's a random passerby, which may be convenient, but it isn't necessarily biased if it's random, which we'll get to later in the lesson. So convenience sampling is all about the ease of access. It's all about asking someone or recording data easily. And so you don't have to work so hard to do it. But when you do it like that, it might be influenced by the people you hang around, okay, or the area you're in, okay, or what's getting the most hits on the internet, all that kind of good stuff, which is why convenience sampling, okay, when push comes to shove, is a pretty biased, it will show you a pretty biased result, okay, of where you live, who your family is, what their demographics are, etc. So convenience sampling is inherently weak to sampling bias. All right, let's talk about the next one. Voluntary response sampling. Voluntary response sampling. This is a bit of a lengthier one. That's another type of sampling that you often see in psychological experiments. If you're taking a psychology class, you've probably watched a couple of videos where they maybe do the little dog experiment, or maybe they do a little behavioral experiment, okay, where they have a participant and they are asked to do a couple of things for that study, and they're recorded at the end of what they did, etc., etc. And the reason we call it voluntary response is because the people or individuals who are part of the sample usually choose by an invitation to conduct that study, be part of that study. I'll talk a little bit later about how studies like at the collegiate or higher level are guilty of this method, but how they offset the bias. Although, just like with any study, there is some bias, of course. You can't really get rid of it at all, okay? But this is another method that is a little weak to sampling method bias, okay? Because usually, if you choose to respond to a sample, it's because you wanted to. And if you wanted to, typically you feel a little stronger about whatever is being asked about or whatever they're talking about. Things like maybe, the receipts from fast food restaurants, they have these little surveys. Most people don't do them, but if you are one of those people who are like, oh yeah, I want free stuff, okay, maybe you do them and you think positively of them because maybe it's your favorite fast food restaurant, or maybe you're like, oh, I can't wait to get some of this free food. Stuff like that makes this a bit weak to bias, just like the convenience sampling. In fact, I would probably say they're kind of related. Okay, they're not always related, but this is kind of another type of convenience where the people who are participating in your study want to, and because they want to, they are a little predisposed to your answerings. All right, so here we got another 3 cases. Let's take a look at which one best shows an example of voluntary response sampling. Now, based on your interpretation, of course, all 3 could be. Okay, could be voluntary response sampling. But I want you to choose the one that fits best. Give you a couple of seconds to do that. All right, hopefully you chose A. Andre is polling people and asking what their fast food favorites are, and participation is voluntary. That's the key there. Another example of maybe a voluntary response sampling is that if you have a Twitter and you see a bunch of polls, maybe by your friends, I know a lot of my friends do this, is that they'll offer some choices, but then they'll offer a see results button, like a choice for seeing the results. That kind of poll is like voluntary and anonymous. So while you could participate in it, nobody's forcing you to do it. Okay, so if you participate in the poll, that is a voluntary effort on your end, which would make a Twitter poll a little biased based on who's following you or who decides to answer the poll based on that outcome. All right. The other 2 here, this is a more of a data collection display, not really talking about a study there, like not really giving them a choice, I'd say. And then part C isn't actually a study on people at all. This is something we'll talk about later, but it has nothing to do with what we're talking about right now. All right, and the third and final sampling method is random sampling. Random sampling. And this, as the name implies, is where your participants in the sample, your individuals, aren't really selected based on convenience or volunteering. Rather, they are chosen at random. Okay, chance process. Very important word. We're going to talk about this a lot during our probability section later this year. But, people get asked, but it's not like they were chosen because of any particular reason, just random they were chosen. This is the only one of the 3 methods we're talking about that is resistant to being affected by sampling bias. Okay, so you got to remember anything, random sampling reduces the chance that your study will be affected by bias. Okay, there is still some bias, don't get me wrong. Like if you're going to survey people in Indianapolis, you're only going to get people who live in Indianapolis. You're not going to get everybody else's opinion across the world. Okay, but typically, if you're talking about reducing your sample, your population, this is a good way to ensure your population's results are non-biased. Let's take a look at some examples. All right, so 3 more cases here. Let's take a look at which one best shows an example of random sampling. All right, random sampling. I'll give you a few minutes to do this. Alrighty, and the answer, of course, is B again. Okay, Family Feud is a show that employs a lot of random sampling. If you've ever seen the show, you know that you get number points based on how many people answered that answer. So it's a pretty good example of random sampling here, I think, anyway, that can be related to. And, it's 100 responses, which is pretty small when they ask across the country, but again, it's pretty good at avoiding bias. Usually the highest answer is one you would expect, okay, and the lowest answer is maybe a niche one that shows up from a few people, okay. Part A is not an example of random sampling. It could be an example of voluntary participation sampling. That's where, if you fill it out, you chose to rather than you were forced to. And part C was just a bit of a wake-up call if you fell asleep during this video. But cold calling is typically not a random sampling. I'm not collecting your answer for like data typically. And if I am, it is a bit of convenience as well, where you're in my class, so I can ask you pretty much whenever I want, right? So not really C either. Although definitely, depending on the way you look at it, could be random. But B is the best fit. All right, so from the video, okay, hopefully you got an understanding of these three different types of sampling and how they all address or are affected by sampling bias. Remember that the first two, convenience and voluntary response, okay, those two are inherently biased or at risk of being affected by bias, sampling bias, whereas random sampling is the most resistant. It is not very biased at all because its random nature prevents people from sharing backgrounds, other than maybe your population and stuff like that. So definitely, studies should definitely look forward to random sampling from a mathematical standpoint. I'm not saying the other two are completely out of the way, because, as I said, colleges and higher level education, when they perform the studies with a like a mastery thesis or something, they usually offer some sort of compensation to make it more appealing to the general public, thus, mitigating some internal bias that way. However, there is still some, you can't get rid of it all, right, when it comes to that kind of measurement. So be very careful comparing these three, okay? There will definitely be a lot of identifying and looking at situations where is there bias in the results? How can I tell? And that kind of stuff. So keep a watch out for that, and I'll see you in class.